55% above market value, Colton Reddick announced, clicking to a slide with my full salary projected behind him, as if I were a line item he'd caught stealing. 19 executives turned to stare. I didn't shout. I didn't crumble. I simply felt something inside me shift. Quiet, cold, final. He thought humiliating me would save his margins. He had no idea what he'd just unplugged from the heart of his company. If stories like this hit close to home, stay with me. And if you can, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. For 13 years, I built the backbone of Ridgepoint Systems without ever needing anyone to clap for me. I managed the relationships no one else could hold, the crises no one else could calm, and the revenue streams Colton Reddick would one day pretend were simply the result of market reputation. I knew every factory that depended on us, every operations manager who called me at 2 a.m. when a production line froze, every CEO who trusted me enough to hand over contracts worth tens of millions because they believed I would keep their world running. That belief wasn't something you buy or benchmark. It was something earned slowly in moments that never made it into quarterly reports. I spent years doing what most people never see: rewriting supply frameworks during snowstorms, renegotiating freight corridors before shutdowns, teaching clients how to avoid equipment failures that could bankrupt them. Ridgepoint didn't grow because we had the cheapest pricing model. We grew because the people who relied on us knew I would not fail them. That knowledge came from experience, not branding. Yet inside our headquarters, the farther I climbed, the more invisible that work seemed to become. The board praised our consistent growth trend. Analysts called us a stable mid-size logistics leader, and Colton, long before he even arrived, was the kind of executive who believed revenue was created by spreadsheets, not relationships. I felt the shift the moment he first toured the building. He didn't ask what we did well. He asked where we could cut. He didn't ask how we retained $5–10 million in annual contracts. He asked why operations salaries were inflated. I'd survived 3 CEOs, 2 recessions, and more supply chain breakdowns than I could count. But nothing unnerved me quite like the way Colton looked at people. As numbers, not assets. I kept doing my job because my clients needed stability, and I wasn't going to let a cost-obsessed newcomer disrupt what I'd built. Still, there was a gnawing anxiety in the air, quiet but sharp enough that longtime managers whispered to each other in hallways, "He thinks he can rebuild the place from scratch." What none of them said out loud was the truth we all felt. Executives like Colton don't actually rebuild anything. They strip what works, slash what they don't understand, and justify the damage with buzzwords. Didn't know yet that he would choose me as his opening demonstration. But I did know one thing. People like him never see consequences coming until they're already drowning in them. Colton hadn't even warmed the leather on his office chair before he started dismantling the culture we'd spent a decade building. He arrived with a binder full of efficiency targets, most of which sounded like they'd been pulled from a podcast about companies he'd never actually worked in. On his first day, he held a town hall where he talked for 43 minutes straight about strategic austerity and realigning internal value perceptions. Not once did he ask a single person in the room what we actually did. I watched him from the 3rd row, arms crossed, while he paced like a man rehearsing a speech he'd given 100 times before. He kept insisting Ridgepoint was bloated, sluggish, and losing its competitive edge, even though we'd just completed our strongest financial quarter in 6 years. Anyone who challenged him got the same sharp smile, the same condescending nod, the same implication that questioning him meant you were part of the inefficiency problem, and people felt it. Seasoned directors who had survived supply chain crashes and equipment failures suddenly tiptoed around their own departments, worried that the wrong budget line would get them labeled obsolete. Even Elijah, our CFO, practical, steady, diplomatic Elijah, stopped speaking up in meetings unless he had charts directly backing him. I realized quickly that Colton wasn't trying to learn Ridgepoint. He was trying to dominate it. He believed fear was a form of leadership, and that cutting costs was the same thing as growing revenue. I'd seen this mindset before, but never in someone who wielded so much unchecked authority. He called one-on-one meetings with every department head except me. Later, I learned why. He'd already pulled my compensation data and was planning to make an example out of me. Before that moment arrived, though, the warning signs were everywhere. Colton replaced our long-standing vendor review committee with a cost innovation panel, staffed entirely with people he'd worked with at his previous job, people who visibly flinched whenever he raised his voice. He slashed travel budgets for client maintenance trips, claiming everything could be handled through video calls, as if a frozen production line in Nevada could be fixed by someone staring at a laptop in Denver. He ordered restructuring drafts from every major division, but insisted they leave the executive comp section blank. "We'll handle that separately," he'd say, tapping his pen against the table like he was waiting for applause. During every meeting, his eyes flicked around the room, searching for his next target, someone he could challenge publicly to prove he was raising performance standards. It was only a matter of time before he pointed that spotlight at me. The irony was painful. He claimed to value results, but never once asked how our biggest accounts survived multiple national supply chain breakdowns. He claimed to value accountability, but never admitted he didn't understand how relationship-based revenue actually functioned. Instead, he treated Ridgepoint like a failing startup he'd been hired to rescue, rather than a thriving logistics engine built on years of trust. I should have been angrier than I was, but mostly I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. Men like Colton always pick the wrong battle, and for reasons they never see coming. He wasn't just about to misjudge me. He was about to misjudge the 141 clients who trusted me more than the logo on the building. The morning of that executive meeting felt wrong before I even sat down. There was a stiffness in the air, a quiet dread that clung to the walls like humidity before a storm. Colton's assistant handed out printed agendas that looked more like warning notices, topics like compensation recalibration, market-aligned restructuring, and cost responsibility audit. I took my usual seat near the center of the table, the same spot I'd occupied for years, surrounded by colleagues who had weathered every crisis with me. But instead of familiar nods or morning greetings, I got quick glances, tight-lipped smiles, and a few eyes that slid away like they didn't want to be caught watching. Colton strutted in 5 minutes late, a practice delay he used to ensure everyone noticed his entrance. He wasn't carrying notes or files, just a remote control for the presentation screen. I felt the first twist in my stomach when the lights dimmed and a slide titled "Operational Efficiency Through Strategic Compensation Realignment" appeared. Not a single person moved. "Let's begin," Colton said, flipping to a chart of Ridgepoint's salary structure. His voice had that airy confidence of someone rehearsing a speech designed to shock. Ridgepoint's compensation model is misaligned with industry expectations. We are paying significantly above market in several executive areas, and it's affecting our margins. He tapped the remote again, and there it was, my full compensation package, my base, my bonus structure, my total cost breakdown, all projected larger than life behind him like an indictment. But it wasn't the numbers that stunned me. It was the bold text across the top. Overcompensated by 55%. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The silence said enough. My pulse hammered in my ears as 19 executives turned toward me with the same expression. Part sympathy, part horror, part fear that they might be next. "Harlow Dane," Colton said, as if introducing a budget item instead of a human being, "earns $355,000 annually. Market analysis indicates this role should fall between $200,000 and $220,000. He clicked again. A new slide popped up showing my proposed corrected compensation. A 39% cut, reduced bonuses, removal of benefits, my value rewritten in a font size an 18. This, Colton continued, is the kind of inefficiency we must correct if we're going to bring Ridgepoint back to competitive levels. Elijah shifted in his chair. I could feel him wanting to intervene, but I also knew why he didn't. Challenging Colton publicly was suicide, and that was the point. Colton wanted witnesses. He wanted to win a fight I hadn't agreed to be part of. "Colton," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I would like to discuss compensation privately. This is not appropriate for an executive forum." He flashed the kind of smile men use when they believe they've cornered someone. "This isn't personal, Harlow. This is about financial discipline. Emotion has no place in cost analysis. Emotion, as if the trust of 141 clients was a mood swing, as if the stability of more than $500 million in annual revenue was a feeling. Your compensation, he continued, addressing the room, is a symbol of outdated practices. Every executive believes they're worth more than the market says, but benchmarks don't lie. Yes, they do, I thought. They lie every time someone treats humans like replaceable variables. Your role, he added, turning back to me, is administrative. Relationship management can be handled by any qualified operations lead. I felt the sting of that word, administrative. I'd pulled factories back from the brink of shutdowns. I'd rebuilt entire logistics systems that had saved companies hundreds of millions. I'd flown across the country at midnight more times than I could count to fix situations someone else had broken. And somehow that was administrative? What's your proposal? I asked. My voice had gone very calm, cold, detached, the kind of calm that comes right before the end of something. Colton clicked one last time. Accept this adjustment by Monday morning, he said, or we'll need to consider alternative arrangements. The lights came back up. He moved on like nothing had happened, but he had made one fatal mistake. He thought he'd embarrassed me. He thought cutting my pay would force me into submission. What he didn't understand was that humiliation is not containment. It's ignition. And he had no idea what he'd just set in motion. I walked out of that conference room with my pulse steady, not shaking the way Colton probably expected. Humiliation can crack people open, but in my case, it clarified everything. 13 years of loyalty had been reduced to a slide deck, a cost line he wanted to amputate for sport. There was no version of Monday where I walked back into Ridgepoint and pretended to negotiate my own devaluation. So I went to my office, closed the door, and stared for a long moment at the photos on my bookshelf. Factory floors I'd helped modernize, client teams I'd saved during equipment collapses, annual banquets where CEOs thanked me quietly for keeping their operations alive. None of that mattered to the man upstairs, but it mattered to the people whose businesses would grind to a halt if the wrong person replaced me. That was the thought that steadied my hands when I turned on my laptop, opened my inbox, and scrolled to a message I'd ignored months ago. An offer from Mason Calder, CEO of Stratacore Dynamics. He'd wanted me to join as Executive Vice President of Client Relations, complete operational authority, equity track, full control over rebuilding their national logistics wing. I had turned him down then because Ridgepoint still felt like home. Now it felt like a spotlight and a firing squad. I dialed Mason's personal number. He picked up on the second ring. Harlow? He sounded surprised, but not confused. Mason has the intuition of someone who watches people closely enough to know when they've been pushed too far. Tell me what happened. Your offer, I said, is it still open? It absolutely is, he replied without hesitation. Do you want to meet Monday? I'll be there at 9. He paused, then asked quietly, what did they do? A bitter laugh caught in my throat. They decided I was overpaid, publicly. Mason inhaled sharply. Then they don't understand the value you hold, and they won't like what happens next. I hung up and drafted the shortest resignation of my life. Effective immediately. No paragraphs, no pleasantries. I sent it to Colton, HR, the board, and Elijah, because he deserved to know before the fallout hit. I shut down my computer, grabbed my coat, and walked out of Ridgepoint without looking back. I was still in the parking lot when my phone buzzed, first with texts from directors, then with missed calls from managers, then with a voicemail from Elijah saying he was deeply sorry and urging me to take care of myself. I wasn't interested in comfort, but I appreciated that he understood a seismic shift had just begun. By the time I got home, the industry rumor mill had already kicked into motion. Word travels fast when a key executive jumps ship unexpectedly. Fast enough that at 5:22 p.m., my phone lit up with a call from Marcus Crew, CEO of Cresslane Fabrication, one of Ridgepoint's highest value accounts. Harlow, he said, skipping any greeting, tell me it isn't true. It's true, I said, leaning back against my kitchen counter. I resigned this afternoon. There was a long silence on the line. Then, "We follow people, not companies. Call me when you land somewhere. I want to discuss next steps." "Marcus, I can't solicit." "I said call me when you land," he repeated slowly. "Our decision will be our own." When the call ended, I stared at the quiet house around me, feeling something I hadn't felt since before the meeting: control. Clients weren't loyal to Ridgepoint. They were loyal to the person who picked up their calls at midnight and didn't flinch when their assembly lines stalled. Colton thought I was a cost problem. He was about to learn I'd been holding the revenue together with both hands, and once I let go, nothing he did would be enough to stop what was coming. By Monday morning, I was already sitting in Stratacor's executive suite waiting for Mason to finalize my contract when my phone began vibrating nonstop. At first, I ignored it. I assumed it was more messages from former colleagues who'd heard whispers over the weekend. But then Elijah forwarded me an email with no explanation, just a single attachment. When I opened it, my breath caught. Crestline Fabrication had submitted formal notice terminating their contract with Ridgepoint effective in 30 days. Marcus hadn't waited for me to land. He hadn't needed to. He knew exactly where he wanted his operations managed, and it wasn't under Colton Reddick's philosophy of replaceable relationships. I hadn't contacted him. I hadn't contacted anyone. Yet the moment he learned I was gone, he made the first move. The second came 12 minutes later, and then the third. By 10:34 a.m., 4 more clients, each responsible for tens of millions in annual revenue, issued their own termination notices, citing leadership instability and critical concerns regarding continuity of oversight. All of that language was polite corporate cushioning for the truth. They didn't trust Ridgepoint without me. Elijah called next. His voice was tight, controlled, but frayed at the edges. "Harlow, you need to know what's happening. Colton is unraveling. He's accusing you of orchestrating this." "I haven't contacted a single client," I said. "My non-compete is intact." "I know," he replied. "Everyone who worked with you knows. But he's losing accounts faster than he can process the reality, and he needs someone to blame." The line went silent for a moment before Elijah added, quieter. "He had no idea how much of our stability depended on you." I appreciated the honesty, but the irony was bitter. I had tried to tell Colton that relationships weren't administrative tasks. He'd dismissed that truth with a smirk and a click of his remote. Now the evidence was hitting him harder than any argument I could have made. A few minutes after Elijah hung up, my phone lit up again. This time with Colton's name. I let it ring. He called again and again. On the fourth attempt, I answered. I didn't bother masking the apathy in my voice. "Yes?" "9 clients," he snapped. 9 clients have submitted termination notices this morning alone. This is coordinated." "It's not," I said. "I haven't contacted them. They're making independent decisions about who they trust with their operations." "This is because of your resignation," he barked. "You knew this would happen." "If you didn't know it would happen," I replied. "That's the problem." The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was stunned, as if he'd only now begun to understand the enormity of the mistake he'd made, but he still wasn't ready to let the truth settle. "You need to come in," he demanded. "We need to stabilize the accounts before more defects occur." "I don't work for Ridgepoint anymore," I reminded him. "Stability is your job now." I ended the call before he could spit out anything else. Mason, who had been listening from across the room, raised an eyebrow. "Ready to sign?" I nodded, because it was already clear Ridgepoint wasn't cracking. It was collapsing, and all I had done was step out of the building before the walls buckled inward. By Wednesday morning, Ridgepoint's panic had reached a pitch you could practically feel vibrating through the phone. I didn't need inside information to know it. Every hour brought a new forwarded termination notice, each one carrying the same sterile corporate phrasing that couldn't hide the truth. Clients were fleeing a ship whose captain didn't understand what kept it afloat. I was deep into transition planning with Stratacor's operations team when Colton called again. This time, I answered out of curiosity more than obligation. The moment his voice hit my ear, I heard something I never expected from him. Fear. 23 clients, he said, not even bothering with a greeting. We've lost 23 clients in 48 hours. I let the number hang there. He needed to feel the weight of it. And you think this is something I can fix? I asked evenly. Harlow listened to me, he said, voice cracking at the edges. I miscalculated, I'll admit that. I shouldn't have handled Friday the way I did. The understatement nearly made me laugh, but I stayed silent, letting him scramble for footing. We're prepared to restore your compensation, he continued quickly. Full reinstatement, plus a performance-based increase of 30%. The offer didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how quickly he'd moved from arrogance to groveling. You publicly called me overpaid, I reminded him. In front of 19 executives, you made my salary a spectacle. I was trying to make a point about efficiency, he insisted, but I see now that the way I presented it created unintended repercussions. Unintended repercussions. That was his name for the financial hemorrhaging he'd triggered? Harlow, we need you back. If this continues, Ridgepoint won't hit its quarter. We might not make the year. There it was. The truth he'd been running from finally clawing its way out. You built our client base, he said, voice low, almost pleading. You're the one they trust. Help us stabilize this, and the board will offer whatever package you want. For a moment I closed my eyes. Not because I was tempted, because this was the moment leaders never see coming. The instant they realize respect is not transferable. Trust is not transferable. Value is not transferable. They'd treated me like a replaceable line item. And now they were watching the revenue follow the person they'd dismissed. Colton, I said finally, I have already accepted the executive vice president position at Stratacore. I'm not coming back. His breath hitched like someone had punched him. You're choosing them over us? I'm choosing a company that understands what I bring to the table. Silence, heavy, miserable. Then he whispered, we can't survive this. You should have thought about that, I said, before you humiliated the person holding your revenue together. I hung up before he could reply. Across the table, Mason looked at me with a knowing smile. Feel lighter? He asked. I did, because Ridgepoint's collapse wasn't my revenge. It was Colton's education, and he was learning every lesson the hard way. By the end of that month, the numbers coming out of Ridgepoint didn't just look bad. They looked fatal. 41 clients gone, tens of millions in annual contracts evaporated week after week, entire departments reduced to skeleton crews because there was no revenue left to justify their existence. I watched it unfold from my new office at Stratacore, sunlight pouring across a desk that actually felt like mine. It was surreal, seeing the company I had held together for over a decade unravel without the slightest resistance. But that's the thing about foundations. When you weaken them, they don't warn you before they crack. They just give out. On my third week, Mason brought me into a conference room filled with former Ridgepoint clients ready to formalize long-term partnerships. These weren't small accounts. They were multi-million-dollar anchors that could make or break a logistics firm. And they all told the same story. We didn't trust where Ridgepoint was headed. Leadership seemed disconnected. You were the stability. Hearing it directly made something inside me settle. Not triumph, not revenge, just confirmation that the work I'd done had meant something real. Meanwhile, the industry press began circling Ridgepoint like vultures smelling a carcass. Headlines speculated about internal turmoil, executive incompetence, mass client exodus. Someone leaked details about Friday's meeting. The slide with my salary, the words overcompensated by 55%, the ultimatum he delivered in front of the entire executive team. Everyone now knew exactly where the implosion had started. 2 months after I walked out, Ridgepoint's board finally removed Colton. Not quietly, not gracefully, they forced him out in a closed-door vote and released a statement citing critical misjudgment in client relationship strategy. The same week, the company was quietly absorbed by a larger conglomerate at a valuation barely half of what it had been the year before. Colton, the man who had tried to make an example of me, ended up taking a regional management job in a much smaller firm. No spotlight, no influence, no audience to impress. And me? Stratacore thrived. The accounts I transitioned over stabilized quickly and even expanded once we modernized their operations. New clients arrived after hearing how I handled crises at Ridgepoint. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting for resources or explaining the value of what I did. I was building something with people who actually understood the stakes. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly projections that exceeded anything I'd managed at my old job, I realized something. I hadn't just survived what Colton tried to do to me. I'd outgrown the entire world he tried to confine me to. Sometimes the collapse isn't the punishment, it's the clearing you need to build something better. And I had. In the quiet that followed Ridgepoint's collapse, I found myself returning to one moment over and over again. The instant Colton clicked to that slide and declared I was overpaid. Not because of the insult itself, but because of what it revealed. He had looked at 13 years of crises handled, relationships forged, and revenue protected, and he saw nothing but a number he wanted to shrink. That's when I finally understood something I should have realized long before. Value isn't measured by salary charts or market comparisons. It's measured by what happens when you leave. And when I walked out, Ridgepoint didn't just wobble, it caved. Clients didn't choose me out of pity or rebellion. They chose me because trust can't be reassigned like a password. It's built in late-night conversations, on factory floors, in moments when everything is falling apart and someone has to be the steady voice. They knew who had stood with them through every breakdown, and they acted accordingly. At Stratacore, I didn't have to justify that truth. Mason never asked me why clients followed. He already understood that relationships are the real infrastructure of any operation. And maybe that's why my work here feels different. I'm not fighting for recognition. I'm building something with people who see clearly what was invisible to those who took it for granted. Every so often, a younger operations manager stops me in the hallway and asks how to survive in a world where leadership sometimes confuses cruelty with strategy. I always tell them the same thing: document your impact, protect your relationships, and never let someone convince you that your worth is negotiable simply because it makes their spreadsheet prettier. If a company can't recognize the value of the person holding its foundations together, walk away before they decide to realign you. Because the truth is simple: companies don't determine your value, consequences do, and nothing reveals the truth faster than watching what collapses the moment you're gone. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd poured into Ridgepoint until the day I walked out with nothing but my dignity. 13 years of late nights, missed dinners, and weekends spent holding other people's businesses together. None of it mattered the moment Colton decided a spreadsheet told a better story than my work. That's the part that stings, even now. It wasn't just the humiliation, it was the realization that I had traded years of my life for leaders who never bothered to understand what that life had cost me. When someone reduces your contribution to a percentage they want to trim, it carves something out of you. And yet, strangely, that loss also clarified what I still had: memory, documentation, my own quiet accounting of everything I'd done when the lights were low and the pressure was high. Those records became the backbone of my confidence when the ground shifted underneath me. I wasn't guessing at my value. I had lived it, tracked it, built it piece by piece. That's the hidden strength most people overlook: the power of knowing your own story before someone else tries to rewrite it. If I hadn't kept those notes, those timelines, those crisis logs, I might have doubted myself when he tried to frame me as an expense, rather than the reason the company survived half its storms. Knowing my history saved me from believing his version of it. So here's what I tell anyone who's ever felt their work disappear into someone else's ego: stay steady, stay aware, and keep your receipts. You may not need them now, but one day they might be the map that leads you out. How to get started today. Write down the real impact of your work this week: names, numbers, outcomes. Save emails or notes that reflect crises you handled or value you created. Track patterns of disrespect early instead of explaining them away. Review your workload honestly. What is costing you health or time? Keep one folder labeled proof, even if you never open it again. What part of this lesson hit closest to your own experiences?